Good morning and good afternoon. On behalf of the Transatlantic Task Force on Ukraine, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the Reanimation Package of Reform, and other partners, both in Kiev and also partners in Brussels, we want to welcome you to today's conversation and a focus on Ukraine's upcoming local elections, which will take place on the 25th of this month. It seems like there's a lot of elections happening over the next several days, but this is a particularly important one, and I want to welcome all of you. I want to welcome my colleagues here in Washington as well, including the Friends of Ukraine Network, the Democracy and Civil Society Task Force. But I also want to thank Bruno, my colleague Bruno, who is in GMF's office in Brussels, for your leadership in helping pull this together as well. Colleagues like John Alexander, but also really our colleagues at RPR, Dennis, who's been just amazing in helping to pull this together. It's a Monday morning here in Washington. And so this particular event is particularly important because of the impact of the election on Ukraine. Right now, we see several things happening in Ukraine, including reemergence of COVID-19, very significant and a scary and challenging issue. We see an upcoming election, local election, that is taking place with a changed political landscape. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of our experts. I think we have an incredible list of experts, also a member of parliament who I really appreciate joining us today to talk about this issue. But there's a number of issues that we wanted to tackle here because both looking from the transatlantic lens of what's taking place in Ukraine to understand better the landscape, what it may look like during the local elections, how will the elections impact needed reforms, how is decentralization, which is something so significant that it's given much more powers to local leaders, oblasts, regional, local, and of course, how will this impact anti-corruption efforts? And I think as many have weighed in from different spaces, there's some concerns about the lack of progress in certain areas in addressing corruption. But judicial reform is something that's high on the list of interest to Ukraine's Western partners, obviously to Ukrainians as well. And when you look at polling numbers, NDI did a poll over the summer that showed a couple of things. One, that Ukrainians want to move forward on a democratic path. They want to see continued reforms, but there's also concerns about wrong direction of the country. And so I'm very interested to see, the key issues. And I know COVID-19 is clearly on the list of concerns, continued war in the East. But when you have local elections, it's a lot about local issues. So we're really interested to hear more about this. I know President Zelensky will address the Rada tomorrow on the 20th, but this is obviously a high stakes election for Ukraine. And there are other factors that we're seeing as well that really matter, which includes the impact of disinformation, the impact of those parties within Ukraine that are closer to Moscow, but also, how are oligarchs re-entrenching themselves back into politics at local levels? So a ton of different things to discuss. I really just appreciate that in an incredibly busy week, we really have some of Ukraine's top civil society experts, and we're going to have a Q&A session that will be moderated from Kiev. But we want to hear more really from our speakers, and I'm just grateful that they're here to join us today, again, during a very busy period. And I wanted to bring in now my colleague, Orest, he and I have co-chaired the Transatlantic Task Force on Ukraine, along with our partners at RPR since it was October 2018. So we're actually at our 2-year, Orest, you may not realize this, but we're at our 2-year anniversary. And the reason why we started this 2 years ago was because of the elections. It was the upcoming Ukrainian presidential election that we were following, and then the parliamentary election, and also concerns about stalling reforms in the previous government that we were shining a spotlight on externally. So if I can, Orest, if I can bring you in as well just to sort of build on this, and then we'll send it over to Kiev after that. And again, thank you to everybody for joining us this morning and this afternoon in Kiev. Thank you. Orest, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and let me join you in offering a warm welcome to our featured speakers in Ukraine. I know they are all busy, and all of you out there in joining us in the virtual world. Now, the same people who cover Ukraine here in Washington, at state, on the Hill, in the policy community, also tend to cover Belarus, which, as we know, is witnessing a historic reawakening, dramatic developments going on there. A lot of them also handle Nagorno-Karabakh, even Kyrgyzstan. So Ukraine perhaps is getting a little bit less attention in Washington than it normally would. Not to mention that we're very distracted by our own elections. So your presentations and perspective are especially welcome at this time. And also, of course, with the fast approaching local elections, which are going to be held, as Jonathan indicated, under a new electoral code and with decentralization reforms and new administrative territorial configurations and whatnot. But there is international attention on these upcoming local elections. You know, IFES, we'll be hearing from an IFES representative, and NDI's involved. And also, I think significantly, the OSCE, which normally focuses on national elections, but this time in Ukraine is also focusing on local elections and is fielding a mission. And then my final point is, you know, notwithstanding that there is less attention being paid to Ukraine maybe than usual for the reasons I cited, there is a widespread perception here that judicial and anti-corruption reforms, both, I need not tell everybody, so essential to the rule of law, are faltering, and that oligarchic forces, especially those linked to Moscow, are enjoying a comeback, not that they ever really completely went away. And those of us who have followed Ukraine for a long time fear that we're seeing the repeat of an old movie, namely, a new president is elected, reforms are promised, some are even delivered, then they stall, then there's even backsliding. We saw this, you know, under Kuchma to varying degrees, even Yushchenko, Poroshenko, Yanukovych. We didn't even see an attempt at reforms, but, you know, I think I'm making that point. So we're seeing this movie perhaps again, because in the first more or less 6 months of the Zelensky administration, and especially with the new Rada, we saw progress. But since March, and especially with the removal of reformers from key positions, the trajectory appears to be heading in the wrong direction. And frankly, one wonders whether Zelensky is squandering the decisive mandate he received last year from the Ukrainian people. Not that he's getting much help from corrupt courts and some other institutions, but, you know, frankly, maybe we're missing some of the nuances. Maybe the situation is more complex than we realize, which is often the case in Ukraine. So I really look forward to our speakers shedding light on what is happening in Ukraine. And with that, let me turn it over to Bruno Lété in Brussels. Bruno?
Thank you very much, dear Orest Deychakiwsky, and a pleasure to be back with you, everyone, and good afternoon from Brussels. Now, I will keep my remarks short in the interest of time, because myself as well, I want to hear from our friends and colleagues in Kiev. I can only say, commenting from a perspective here in Brussels, I can say that the issue of the local elections remains high on the European agenda, despite so much attention being hijacked by the corona crisis. So Ukraine and the elections are a priority for the EU and the political agenda, also by the simple fact that the European Union is already so much invested in Ukraine over the past years. Just to give a figure, I think over 15 billion euro has been given to Ukraine in terms of loans and grants. Europe is one of Ukraine's largest international partners. So there's a lot of money involved, and of course, therefore, as well, the local elections are closely being watched here in Brussels. I would say there's reason, or at least in this city, there's optimism and there's some concern as well. Optimism because, yes, indeed, Ukraine has achieved so much over the past years when it comes to reform, public finance, banking sector, energy. Ukrainians can look back to an impressive list. And many of those reforms actually have also happened on the local level. It's not just Kiev and the national level performing on that end. So there's hope that the EU can continue to work with some of the people that are now in place, and also at the level of cities. So that's the importance of the local elections. I think what people also observed here in Brussels is that there's a lot of satisfaction that actually the elections are taking place in a democratic manner, despite the complicated health and safety conditions of the corona crisis. So that's a positive one. But yes, also concern. As I said, it looks like Zelensky's political party is increasingly struggling to implement reforms, and that may actually reflect on the upcoming elections. It's been noted here, for instance, that none of the leading candidates or incumbents in Ukraine's major cities will be running under a Zelensky party banner. Most of these incumbents are actually having their own local platforms. So, in other words, perhaps, yes, the Servant of the People Party will win the local elections. Maybe they will. But it doesn't really mean that they will improve their power base in these cities. And as we know, all politics is local. So the result of these local elections may render Zelensky's ability to implement firm reforms less secure, also at this very important local level. And for the EU, it's important to know that the EU is working with a team that is able to deliver on those reforms, and that this team is backed by the majority of the population. And so the result of these local elections will further shape the European Union's view on those two questions. So that's it for my part, a brief remark from Brussels. I really look forward to the conversation, and thank you very much for including us in this.
Great.
Passing to you.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you so much for reminding us about, obviously there was a recent EU-Ukraine summit, and which was really positive. But I do think, what Orest also said too about how, there is concern amongst Ukraine's partners about the reform effort, and concerns that perhaps even with a parliamentary majority that the Zelensky government is not moving forward in the way that it should. And this has an impact both on sort of how Brussels and Washington view, but clearly has an impact on the IMF potentially as well, which has been really important. So on that note, and I think we've sort of listed some of the key topics and areas, I wanted to send it over to Denis in Kiev, our partner at RPR, to moderate, and then again to introduce our speakers briefly and to open up the conversation. And again, thank you to everyone for joining on all sides of the Atlantic. Denis, over to you.
Thank you for your remarks, and definitely, as Bruno mentioned, these elections matter. And I propose to start our discussion today with elections, and we have two speakers today to speak about elections. This will be Olha Aivazovska, who is a chair of the board at OPORA network, and Denis Kovryzhenko, who is an expert in electoral systems and cooperates with IFA's team in Ukraine. Then I propose to move to hear about anti-corruption, the state of anti-corruption reform, which will be presented by Andrei Borovik, who is an executive director of Transparency International Ukraine. And then I propose to hear about judicial reform, which is a very hot topic now. And please welcome Halyna Chyzhyk to address the issues of judicial reform. She is a judicial reform expert at Anti-Corruption Action Center. And we also, what is also important today, we have the member of parliament, Yasko, who is who represents today the Servant of the People fraction. And we hope that Ms. Yasko will address the issues of the experts that they will mention during their statements, and also speak about Ukraine-EU forum, which went very good and was significantly important. So I propose to start with Olha Aivazovska. Ms. Aivazovska, the floor is yours. You have 7 minutes to speak.
Hello to everyone. It's very difficult to speak about everything according to our assessment during only 7 minutes, but I'll try. So I focus on few things and few topics. First of all, it's about new legislation. The second one, it's about elections during the COVID pandemic issue. And I'm going to talk about so-called opinion polls from the president on election day and general violations and issues across electoral processes. So my organization called Civil Network OPORA, and we already have more than 200 long-term observers which started to work from the 1st August. And you can find many materials, analytical reports, statements and articles, what is going on in Ukraine during this electoral process, about Facebook advertising, about violation and quality of legislation across elections, and about some very important issues during elections. And we are going to have 1,500 STOs, short-term observers, on election day. We trained national police with the trainings about new electoral legislation, and our trainings participated more than 50,000 of policemen. And we produce many awareness materials for regular citizens, because we have many news, not only about electoral procedures, but about rights and about responsibilities for our voters too. These elections is very important because of finalization stage of national-wide decentralization reform. The quality and the value of each of the mandates is much more higher than we had in 2010 or 2015. That's why the fight for this mandate looks like more hotter and sometimes out of legislation. Unfortunately, Ukrainian parliament decided to change electoral system little close to the start of official campaigning. And the second reading for electoral code happened in July this year. That's why many politically active people on the ground who wanted to participate on this election didn't know how these rules will look like, because we are talking not only about procedures, we are talking about new electoral system which happened with us 2 months before less than 2 months before official start of campaigning. And this electoral system showed that political parties in the parliament had consensus to prevent the participation of the people out of the parties, because the political parties got the monopoly for registration candidates to the local councils from the communities, in the communities from 10,000 voters. I'm talking about villages, small cities, rayon level councils, and oblast level councils. At the same time, if you want to participate, you had to negotiate with political parties. We have more than 350 political parties in Ukraine. At the same time, it doesn't mean that it's so diverse political system in this country, because many of political groups do not have the real activities on the ground or real party institution on the ground, which might help to participate on the self-government level policies and politics. We have a good progress in some of the areas. First of all, it's about human rights. because Ukrainian parliament adopted very liberal norms for internally displaced people and people, so-called mobile people inside the country who are living or working out of the cities where they have registration. Now, even IDPs who have registration on occupied territories have a right to vote on the local level. We have very tough gender quota because none of political parties which had a plan to register less than 40% of the women in their party list were registered. And it's a good news from our side because we fight it for this progress for 7, 5, and many years ago, and now it's a part of our reality. But at the same time, this monopoly for political party to participate in election violated Venice Commission rules and recommendation about predictability of the legislation for whole participants. And at the same time, it was violation of Copenhagen's documents about competition between political party list and other groups. We do not have competition. Only political party have right to participate on these elections. And of course, there were many gaps in electoral code, and we have to advocate new norms, new rules, and new procedures, because now electoral code is a huge document for more than 400 pages with so detailed procedures that it's our reality. We have a gaps in legislation. That's why Central Election Commission has to adopt or promote understanding what does it mean this or that article if the MPs did mistakes, just mistakes. From another hand, we do not have equal rights for whole Ukrainians to participate in self-government level policies because we do not have election in 18 communities on Donbas. And a few of them had election in 2015. Many of them had election last year when we had presidency and parliamentary campaigning. And unfortunately, there is a conflict of interest between those groups who decided that it's not secure area for elections and those groups who do not have this election. I'm talking about civil military administration, because after 25th of October, they will have all rights and responsibilities on these territories. And near 500,000 of Ukrainians do not have right to participate now because they are living on those communities. And I'm talking about Severodonetsk or Lysychansk, which are the political centers with new infrastructure projects, with children gardens, with schools which are working day by day without any problems. But someone decided that these citizens do not have a right to vote for their self-government level bodies. And I believe that we have to promote new legislation to call this first election next spring, because it's against human rights and it's against any logic, especially when we are talking about the language, peaceful language from the presidential side about election on occupied territories. Unfortunately, it's a reality for now. I want to focus on this presidential so-called poll in electoral day, which will happen 25th of October in different regions. Unfortunately, president started to be subject of the electoral process in local elections. He started to advocate the interest of Sluha Narodu, People's Servant Party, because in his public conversation, he used slogans from the campaigning of Sluha Narodu Party. He called people to participate on this questionnaire, and he used his working hours for PR campaigning. Unfortunately, it's not according to constitution. That's why we recommended president to ensure the voting rights of Ukrainian citizens We are public demonstration of equal attitude to citizens having different political position and views in accordance with Article 102 of the Constitution of Ukraine, to ensure that the activities of the President of Ukraine, other officials and authorities are based on within the limits of authority and in the manner stipulated by the Constitution of law and other laws. These guarantees are vitally important to ensure the competitiveness of electoral process and political process as a whole. To promptly publish a complete methodology for organization and conduct of the poll initiated by President of Ukraine to ensure that budgetary resources are not used for realization of the corresponding poll in any form, and ensure full transparency of funding source for this initiative. Do not allow campaigning in support of electoral subject during the organization of the poll on the eve and during the election day. Such campaigning would be a violation of Ukrainian law guarantees equal opportunities for candidates as well as transparency of their campaign financing. To abandon an already exciting practice of using slogans and election program of the Servant of People Party or any other political force, as well as its local cells, during the promotion, organization, and realization of the poll initiated by President of Ukraine. And the COVID-19 issues, my final topic, very shortly. I hope that this election will be safety. At the same time, I believe the president has to focus on the safety election, not agitation for one of political party. And the problem is that it's local election. That's why it has to be communication and cooperation between national power and local powers. We know that the government somehow expanded special funds for the local level, but unfortunately local self-government bodies said publicly, many of them, that they do not know what to do. On election day, they didn't procure any equipment for voters or members of electoral commissions. They do not know how to aware citizens about the national rules for organizing local elections on election day without these COVID-19 measures. And they do not have money for this equipment. That's why we are talking now a few days, 6 days before election day, and we do not have a answer to my question, how secure will be this election day? For now, we have more than near 6,000 people with COVID day by day, and a week after election, we may have a huge wave with COVID-19 citizens. And at the same, it doesn't mean that the election will end a week after 25th of October, because we are going to have second round on big cities with a citizen, more than 75,000 of the voters. That's why we have to secure not only this October time, but November time too, because there is no any predictability what will happen after November or during the winter with COVID-19 measures and quarantine issues. So very brief presentation. I hope that you will have some questions.
Thank you, Ms. Aivazovska. We have one more speaker to address the election issues. This will be Denis Kovryzhenko, who is an expert in electoral systems and works with IFES in Ukraine. Mr. Kovryzhenko, please elaborate in the issues which Ms. Aivazovska mentioned, and you have 7 minutes to speak.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be very brief, and basically, in to some extent, I will just duplicate what Olga has already said before. So to start with, I would say that currently we have more or less effective legal framework that allows for free and democratic elections. However, it suffers from significant flaws as it was adopted at 11th hour before the start of the electoral process during this ongoing local elections. The parliament tried to fix those flaws by amending the electoral code. However, there was no success as majority didn't have enough votes to support that decision. Currently, we are operating based on the legal framework that was introduced in July this year, and many parties and other electoral stakeholders were not properly prepared for the new realities, basically to the new electoral system that was introduced by that code. Among the key, I would say, I would also note some positive developments related to improvement of the legal framework, including more specific regulation of certain procedures, for instance, related to vote counting, vote tabulation, and establishment of the election results. Introduction of the feasible gender quota, which provides not only for mandatory inclusion of a certain percentage of women in each group on the party list, but also sanctions for failure to comply. That was an issue in 2015 when the legal framework also contained the provisions governing the quota, but there were no sanctions in place, and many parties just failed to comply without any particular consequences of that. Among the key issues that affecting or would likely affect the election themselves, I would of course stress the importance of COVID crisis, and Parliament tried to, not Parliament actually, the CEC tried to figure out how to deal with the issue on the election day by adopting recommendations through its resolution. However, this recommendation is not binding, and any restrictions of the right to elect, or at least attempts to regulate the election day procedures, keeping in mind the COVID crisis, should be laid down in the laws, which never happened. And basically, I think that this issue would complicate the voting itself, and also may have a negative impact on voter turnout, which is crucial for representation of electoral constituencies in the local councils, because the factual representation strongly depends on voter turnout on the election day due to peculiarities of the system itself. Another issue to mention is that open list system is quite complicated, and parties are now, and candidates are now trying to explain how it is, how it should be used in practice, how the ballot paper should be filled. But I think, we can all expect a certain level of confusion during on the election day, because many voters, I'm pretty sure that many voters, at least certain part of them, will not know how to fill the ballot papers correctly, and this may lead to cancellation or invalidation of certain percentage of ballot papers. CC tried to do its job in order to raise voter awareness about the key procedures and how to fill the ballot papers, but in fact, I think that the issue still remains, and basically because the code was adopted just a few months before the elections themselves. So to be properly administered, the election should be governed by the based on the law that is adopted well in advance of the elections, as recommended by the Venice Commission Code of Good Practice in Electoral Matters. I will not, of course, mention all the issues related to elections, but I also I want to specifically highlight campaign finance and election campaigning itself. Due to the fact that code suffers from significant legal flaws, and it fails to specify how many electoral fund accounts can be opened by a specific local party organization or by candidate. We, in many regions, we have misinterpretation of the legal requirements by the banks, and in fact, many electoral campaigns were cross-funded from different election funds due to late issuing of the instruction by the National Bank of Ukraine. And in fact, I think that the parties just faced with a mess related to campaign finance funding. They didn't know how to open accounts. Banks just delayed opening certain accounts, and overall, parties were forced to operate and conduct election campaigning in this complicated legal environment. And finally, I also agree with Olga that the role of the incumbents in the election process remained pronounced, and this election day survey initiated by the President Zelensky is one of the issues that raises serious concerns among the election experts and the public in general here in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. And just before we move forward, I would kindly ask you to address one final question. Do you think, you and Olha, do you think this election is going to be free, fair, and transparent, particularly if it is to compare with the 2019 elections, which were widely praised as being up to international standards? Just one thought on one final thought. Olha, if you...
I can answer to your question, because there is international standard about observation on election, and we do not predict something. We are going to observe, analyze, and have deep analytical materials about facts. That's why we do not predict violation, which doesn't happen yet.
Dennis, one thought.
It's difficult to assess at this specific stage because everything depends on how the election day and vote tabulation procedures will be administered. And so far, I would say that many stages of the electoral process were conducted in a democratic and legal manner. However, we also faced some difficulties that were previously faced during the other elections conducted throughout Ukraine. I mean, lack of professionalism among the electoral administrators, opaqueness of the campaign finance, poor regulation of campaigning itself, and so on and so forth. But at this point, of course, it's premature to say whether the elections were held were free and democratic, because we're still waiting for the election day itself and for finalization of the vote tabulation and establishment of the election result. But at this point, I would say that currently the electoral process is overall competitive, peace and calm, and we need just to see whether it is finalized in effective way, so international and domestic observers can say that elections were held based on the democratic international standards.
Thank you. Thank you for this briefing on elections issues. I also ask you to stay longer and participate in our Q&A session at the end of this event. But we're now today talking not only about elections, and I would invite Elizaveta Yasko, who is a member of parliament and represents today the Servant of the People fraction. Ms. Yasko, the floor is yours. Could you tell us, please, more about the Ukraine-EU summit, which was, as I mentioned, which was significant for both partners, and also react to the comments of the experts that you have heard?
Sure. Well, first of all, my honor to represent, to be one of the speakers who represent the parliament today and the Servant of the People Party. So thank you for the invitation. And secondly, yes, I would like to react first on some statements and some comments about upcoming local elections. And to state that, in my opinion, something that is going to happen in a couple of days is actually quite unique, because in my opinion, this is the first time in the local elections when we have them so competitive. I mean, lots of local parties, lots of parties, they really have like a strong electoral process now. They are campaigning, they're trying to win more attention. I think first, this is one of the really unique moments in Ukrainian history. Yes, unfortunately, my party, Servant of the People, according to the polls, we are losing some of the support, which is unfortunately true. But I think the most dangerous thing is that unfortunately, pro-Russian forces gain more and more support, especially in the east and in the south, which is very dangerous. And I think this is number one danger and risk that we are currently facing, and we should be very honest and transparent and open about it, because we know what kind of values people of Medvedchuk bring. That is really, really dangerous for Ukraine. I can tell you that, of course, there are two sides of democracy in our democratic approach of the servant of the people party. From one side, yes, we really voted for the new electoral code, and we will have our elections with the new territorial districts. We believe in decentralization. We believe that more power should be given to the people who are in their constituencies, in their villages, in their cities. This is very important. But in the same time, we understand that there is some chaos in a country, and it's also quite dangerous, but still we believe that, of course, free will is the basic value, and we should always stick to it. So if voters want to vote for another party, this is free, and I think it's very special that, like me, being a representative of the ruling party and saying such thing, because it means that we really value freedom and democracy. This is what I wanted to comment about the local elections. And turning to the EU summit, what's important to say? For us, it was a very important moment, because there were some gaps in communication, and some internal and external propaganda really worked well, that was telling that President Zelensky or our party are not pro-European or something, which is not true at all. The EU summit now just only confirmed that we are very, very confident about our way for the further cooperation, especially in the questions that concern trade for Ukrainian export goods and services. That is very important for us. Also, of course, we got some very positive reaffirming messages that EU, of course, stays with us on the principle of territorial integrity, that non-recognition of annexation and condemnation of aggression in Donbass was said there. That's very important for us. Other important question is so-called industrial visa-free regime. That's also very important. So we will have finally some updates in our document of the association agreement. That's also very important. And also there is other important achievement is about Open Sky Agreement. EU reaffirmed that they're ready to sign it next year. We know that the text actually of it was approved around 7 years ago, but unfortunately due to some internal and technical issues, it was not, it didn't have any development since that time. But at this summit, and from Ukrainian side and from the EU side, we reaffirmed that we really want that. So hopefully it's going to happen next year. So this is like the main messages. Of course, unfortunately, we live in a time of COVID, so there could be some postponement of some processes, but still, I think there is no reason to panic. I know that I often hear from Ukrainian media whether we won't have any visa-free regime with the EU anymore. This was also addressed during the summit, that we will, of course, have a visa-free regime, but now, unfortunately, we have COVID problem. That's why we have some restrictions, but still, of course, it's in force and it's very reaffirming, and that for us, it's very important. I can also say that in my committee on the foreign affairs, some weeks ago, we voted for the priorities for interparliamentary cooperation, where of course European integration was a part of it. So I hope it's reconfirming and affirming. I know that unfortunately we have problems sometimes with communication, and I hear quite often from our Western partners that there is a lack of trust, that we don't speak enough. Sometimes we don't communicate enough what we want, and there is no sometimes transparent understanding of what's happening also in our parliament. We know that, for example, we had some issues with voting on some questions on anti-corruption. Institutions, and there were some issues, but still we always say, and we always say that we always are for transparency of these processes. Unfortunately, we have many MPs in our party that creates sometimes difficulties, but the president always says that we are very open and democratic and pro-European party. Thank you very much. I would be happy, unfortunately I will need to leave in 10 minutes, but I would be happy to stay in touch afterwards with any means of online communication that we currently have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yasko, for your statement. And could you please address one question regarding the EU-Ukraine summit? As we heard, the closed part of negotiations was devoted to discuss judicial reform. And what are the perspectives after the negotiation? And is there any change of approach expected? If you have any information on thoughts on these issues, you're welcome to address.
Could you please specify, like, judicial reform, the close part? What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
EU partners communicated that they will discuss judicial reform during the closed part of the negotiation, non-public part of the negotiations. And as a result, what is happening, and is there a change of approach expected? Approach to implement judicial reform, because this is one of the crucial topics right now.
I don't think that there is any crucial change that might happen. As I said, anti-corruption reform and judicial reform is one of our priorities. I know there is lots of criticism, but my personal stance is that this is our real priority, and our Western partners are sometimes concerned by what can happen and what kind of messages they get from Ukraine. But in the information that I currently have, we don't expect any new mysterious approaches to this question.
Thank you, and thank you for your positive attitude toward the reforms. If we're talking about judicial reform and anti-corruption reform, please welcome our next speaker, which will be Andriy Borovik, Executive Director of the Transparency International Ukraine. Mr. Borovik, please address the issues, highlight the current issues of anti-corruption reform which we have.
Denis, thank you for inviting me to this panel. Unfortunately, after 6 years of anti-corruption reform, that was also one of the main, as it was said by the previous presidential administration, one of the main directions. There is still lots of issues within that, and unfortunately, after the first year of the new parliament and new president, we came to the point when we again watching the old movie, as was mentioned by Orest from the very beginning of our discussion. Again, the main engines for the anti-corruption reforms are the international community, international organizations, and the civic society. That's my personal feeling, and that's even after the really good autumn last year, when lots of legislative changes were voted in the parliament. An ACP reboot, National Agency on Corruption Prevention, a few changes to the Criminal Procedure Code, return of illicit enrichment, and the implementation of civil forfeiture, a launch of high anti-corruption court. All of this was done under the new administration and was quite often sabotaged by the previous one. But this was a year ago, and after the year one, we now have a reverse situation regarding anti-corruption infrastructure and much higher level of, let's say, not chaos, but uncertainty. Judicial reform is not done. I think my colleague, she will continue and much more than me. And if talking by every agency, which we usually say is anti-corruption infrastructure, almost in every sphere there is that or another problem. If talking about the NABU, the main investigative body who's supposed to fight the top-level corruption, after the Constitutional Court rulings, there is situation with the head of NABU and some other articles within the law are not regulated. And if I'm not mistaken, there is another 2 months for the parliament to fix this problem, but I do not see lots of political, let's say, discussions regarding these issues, but what discussions can be if the ruling of the Constitutional Court is pretty clear. But there is an attempt to, at some point, saying that the president is supposed to be the main guy who's responsible for the anti-corruption, and let's change the constitution. But this is not what the Constitutional Court says. It says amend the law according to the state of powers in the country. If talking about the other institutions like Assets Recovery and Management Agency, the situation there is even worse, because it's more than a year, as I remember, it's without a proper head. So there is a temporary head for a year. The legislation for improvement of this sphere was failed during the second reading. If talking about NACP, the reboot of which was really successful with involvement of international experts and was conducted under really high standards, representatives of TI Ukraine and AntAC as well were among the selection commission. There is still a few issues, for example, regarding the whistleblowers protection. But one of the main ones and the recent ones are the anti-corruption strategy. I would like to remind to our listener that the Ukraine, the country who's supposed to fight the corruption, was living without anti-corruption strategy since 2017. And it was developed, presented, supported by international community and by some MPs as well, submitted to the parliament. But I don't think that somebody can say now when it will be voted and when it will be supported. And moving with the reform without exact strategy and operating plan, I think it's a wrong thing, and it was actually proved by the previous years. One of the most frightening things now is actually the selection of specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's officer, because this is a person who's actually responsible for organizing the work of prosecutors who representing the case in the court. And on the presentation of the case, the decision by the judges depends a lot. Unfortunately, the first meeting last week of the selection commission for the head of SAPO showed that one of the members, who was, by the way, supported by the parliament and the larger part of one majority, doesn't have a legal status to be the part of this commission, because he is officially a police officer, and this is directly prohibited by the law on prosecution. So in this composition, the commission cannot work further and develop the competition and select the anti-corruption prosecutor, because if it will be done in any point of time, any participant can just go to the court saying that the selection commission didn't have enough of legal status because of the one person who was within the commission. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it depends with whom we are talking to. Constitutional Court last year is actually one of the main newsmakers in Ukraine. There is a lot of different proceedings within Constitutional Court. I already mentioned it about the NABU, but we are still waiting about their decision on the High Anti-Corruption Court and the open procedure in development and formation establishment of High Anti-Corruption Court that happened more than a year ago. Specifically, there is the MPs from actually pro-Russian parties in the parliament questioning the participation of international experts during the selection. There is also another proceeding according to the monitoring of the declarations and the way of style of civil servants is also questioned in the Constitutional Court. There is lots of different rumors when the decision will be, but if it will be negative, so all this legislation need to be changed, that will be a huge hit for the whole anti-corruption infrastructure. But in Ukraine, we try to stay positive. And nevertheless, that anti-corruption sphere goes beyond the anti-corruption infrastructure. There are some good developments within the management of state assets and the lease of property. I just would like to remind that almost every fifth case opened by NABU are related to corruption at the state-owned enterprises. So the State Property Fund of Ukraine, who are now responsible for the management of the state-owned enterprises and asset property and the lease of state assets, are now doing really good job. They were not fired last March. They work in more than a year, and I think in this political reality is really time for them. And I hope that the only visible now problem with the privatization is actually the COVID pandemic, because it is very hard to conduct open, big privatization within the country when nobody can come to the country for the auctioning. But I will continue their work, and keeping in mind that actually privatization, at least these days, is probably the only source of money for the state budget, because we see that there is some slowdowns in cooperation with IMF, World Bank, and other international financial institutions. Yeah, I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your statement and for joining us. And Ms. Yasko, before you left, we have two questions for you. The first one is from Rebecca Harms, who is asking that some major issues which caused problems for relations and the mood in Brussels were connected to the issues of lack of independence of the National Bank of Ukraine, and the field of judiciary, also the pressure of NABU. Could you please address this issue? The question is, how do you see the consequences? And yes.
Yeah, wait a second, I'm reading this this question again. Or could you repeat it, please, because
some major issues which caused problems for relations and the mood in Brussels were connected to the issues of lack of independence of National Bank, and in the field of judiciary, also to the pressure of NABU on NABU. How do you see the consequences of this? Again, there were problems with the disbursement of IMF and EU financial assistance.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's quite a difficult question, I know, because we have some disagreements sometimes inside our team on this. Well, what I can say is that I personally think that NABU is a very important institution, and I personally think that the current head of NABU has all the reasons to be the head of NABU, and though that that processes that go against him actually they don't have enough reasoning. I think some of groups of interests who really are not interested in fighting corruption are doing some different informational attacks. I can say that I don't believe that the parliament would vote something that will make NABU or our national bank less independent, which means that I can tell you, like from the internal processes and discussions that we have, yes, there is some will from small groups to create some negative processes, but I don't think that that this really will affect anything considerably. So I don't think it will be something dramatic.
Thank you. And the last question, also what I can ask you to address very briefly, how would you characterize President Zelensky and Sluga Narodu relationship with various oligarchs and how they are impacting the judicial reform and battle against corruption? This question is by Adrian Karmazin.
Well, in my opinion, I think the Sluga Narodu party is the third party in the history of Ukraine that is really democratic and transparent and has an impartial approach towards different groups of interests. So I think there are no reasons really to worry. We, of course, again, we know that there is different information going on around, but still, like you can see many young people who come from the ordinary background. They never had any links to any oligarchs. So this is my answer.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers and thank you for being with us today. And if we're talking about oligarchs, Andriy Borovik, in your statement, you mentioned that pro-Russian parties, but what is about the influence of oligarchs and also what is the current role of oligarchs pushing back against judicial and anti-corruption reforms?
I didn't mention oligarchs only because, in my opinion, oligarchs and pro-Russian forces usually act together, and they have the same tactical aim, which is to ruin the anti-corruption infrastructure. I'm sure that for Kolomoisky or Bakhmatyuk or Martylenko, they are all dreaming that all this cruel, from their point of view, NABU and SAPO were ruining, because it is obvious that, for example, as NABU working their experience with the Kolomoisky case, his proceedings with an FBI, it was evident FBI in the US would be much harder to achieve the results. They also see such a guy as Martylenko, whose case is now in the court, and he was already sentenced in Switzerland. So they see that this anti-corruption infrastructure, which was built for the last 5 years, it really works. So for them, it would be much better if they could just ruin it and let's just forget about it. From my personal feeling as a citizen, for the last year, and not even a year, I think a little less than a year, I never seen so many different PR messages on the television and internet. It's actually everywhere, and the push, and unfortunately, some of the MPs, groups of MPs within the 70 of the people also support this narrative about the head of NABU or any other anti-corruption institution. Unfortunately, the narrative about the Sarasyata, about the Soros, is now much more circulated within the media than it was during the Poroshenko times. So if comparing these two things, so then the environment in which we were working more than a year ago was much more friendly than we're working now. But I do not believe that these efforts will be easily to implement, honestly, because for the 5 years, anti-corruption institutions, the employees of these institutions became much more tougher, and they know how to survive because they survived too many different attacks for the last 5 years. It's not NABU now is a different to NABU in 2016, for example.
Thank you for your answer. We mentioned several times during our discussion the importance of judicial reform, and I propose to hear the expert, Halyna Chyzhyk, who is judicial reform expert of the Anti-Corruption Action Center. Please, 7 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Denis. Good morning or good afternoon, dear participants. Unfortunately, we see that the course of reforms and especially judicial reform in Ukraine is moving in a negative direction. For the last years, the political landscape in Ukraine has majorly changed. And however, Ms. Yasko, representative of Ukraine's parliament, says that approach towards judicial reform has not changed, but 4 months have passed since Ukraine signed a memorandum with IMF, but still relevant bills concerning judicial reform have not been even submitted to the parliament. However, according to the memorandum, till the end of October, the relevant legislation has to be adopted. A year ago, we saw that the president was really reforms-oriented, and in fact, he submitted a very good law on judicial reform to the parliament. It concerned the reform of judicial governance bodies, High Qualification Commission of Judges, and the High Council of Justice. But unfortunately, the implementation of this law was blocked by the High Council of Justice itself. And afterwards, the Constitutional Court ruled on its unconstitutionality. Now we are in a situation when we need international partners to stress out the importance of proper and complex judicial reform, which is a precondition for further cooperation with Ukraine. And importantly, the joint statement of the European Union and Ukraine, which was issued after the latest summit in Brussels, mentions the need for the reform of the High Council of Justice. Thus, we see that the statement is very specific. It is not only says about the rule of law reform in Ukraine or judicial reform. It says that the High Council of Justice needs to be reformed. Because High Council of Justice is the key to reform the rest of Ukraine's judiciary. And it is our main lessons learned from the past 6 years of reforms. Unless we properly reform this body, we cannot reform other Ukrainian courts, because this body decides on appointments and dismissal of judges. It takes judges to disciplinary responsibility. So the whole Ukrainian judiciary depends on decisions that are taken specifically in the High Council of Justice. And what we saw from the practice of this body for the past 4 years is that judges who take illegal decisions, politically motivated decisions, they were not dismissed. At the same time, they were promoted even to the Supreme Court. And however, I'm not talking about elections, but I want to mention the courts that will decide on the results of the elections, specifically District Administrative Court of Kiev. A few months ago, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine published information revealing large-scale corruption in this court. And leadership of the court and other judges are suspected of creation of a criminal group, bribery, and taking illegal decisions. However, these judges were not suspended, and they in few weeks, they will decide on the elections results. And the reason these judges were not suspended is the High Council of Justice. Instead of suspending judges suspected in corruption, High Council of Justice made a statement against NABU, which revealed important information about the corruption in the court. We have an urgent need to reform the High Council of Justice, which members itself have major issues with integrity. One bright example, one of the HCJ member, when was asked about the money used to fund the purchase of a house in Kiev, she answered that in late 80s, she gathered strawberries in German Democratic Republic, and this is how she afforded the purchase of luxurious house in Kiev. In June, as far as you know, Ukraine has signed a memorandum with IMF, and it committed itself to renewal of the composition of the High Council of Justice. Memorandum suggests a model under which an independent panel has to be established, and this panel, including international experts in its composition, has to conduct pre-selection of members of this body, High Council of Justice, and also it has to conduct ad hoc assessment, integrity assessment of current composition of the High Council of Justice. Thus, we understand that this is the way how we can renew the composition of the High Council of Justice and ensure the integrity of its composition. If people who decide on appointments and dismissal of judges meet the integrity criteria, we may be sure that these people will appoint judges who meet the integrity criteria and will dismiss those who do not. Importantly, this model suggested by memorandum with IMF, and then the same model was envisaged by MFA agreement Ukraine signed with the EU. It does not contradict the constitution of Ukraine, as final decisions will be taken by appointed bodies mentioned in the constitution. And important also is that the Venice Commission positively assessed its model, this model in its recent opinion on Ukraine. But unfortunately, however, the memorandum with IMF suggests that the law on reform of the High Council of Justice has to be adopted till the end of October. The relevant bill has not even submitted to the parliament yet. However, today is the 19th of October. And given the fact that Ukraine's parliament is now on quarantine, it is unlikely that we can adopt such legislation within 1 or 2 months already. However, the bill that implements these Ukraine commitments, it was drafted by the Ministry of Justice, but according to our information, the promotion of this bill is sabotaged within the Cabinet of Ministers. At the same time, we have to take into account the fact that even after the memorandum with IMF was signed, and when it became obvious that the High Council of Justice sabotaged the first attempt of Zelensky to have judicial reform, President submitted to the parliament a bill on the competition to Judicial Commission, High Qualification Commission of Judges. And within this bill, he suggested to give even more powers into the hands of the High Council of Justice. And important also is that this bill contains provisions contradicting memorandum with IMF in regard to the High Council of Justice. Thus, given the fact that draft of Ministry of Justice that implements the model of High Council of Justice reform is not moving forward, and taking into account the fact that the president submitted the law contradicting memorandum, we may assume that promotion of the draft is sabotaged by the president's office because they may try to prepare their own draft. It is a very possible scenario, and we should not forget that President's office already tried to empower the High Council of Justice by amended legislation and given more powers in regard to the High Qualification Commission of Judges to these bodies. The only effective way now, the only working solution for judicial reform is a complex reform of the High Council of Justice and High Qualification Commission of Judges. This can only be possible if international experts are granted a crucial role in the process. We have a positive and successful experience with the establishment of the High Anticorruption Court, and that is why international agreements of Ukraine suggest to include international experts into the composition of a panel that will be in charge of assessing integrity of members of the High Council of Justice and future candidates of the High Council of Justice. At the same time, the selection panel that will assess candidates for the High Qualification Commission of Judges will also include international experts, but one big threat is that when the draft law is considered within the parliament, the role of international experts may be weakened, and their possibility to influence the results of the competition may be neglected, either in President's office, which draft the bill, or within the parliament when it is considered by members of parliament. That is why we have a situation right now when, on one hand, judicial reform is a top priority, and it is a precondition for further cooperation of Ukraine with the Western countries. But from the steps taken by President's office and servants of People political party, we do not see real political will to conduct the reboot of judicial governance in Ukraine. The only working solution is to grant a crucial role of international experts in the process, and how this is implemented, we will see in the nearest few months. So here is the situation as it is right now.
Thank you for joining us and for your speech, and thank you for linking judicial reform with elections. And I would also link judicial reform to anti-corruption strategy, as Andriy Borovik mentioned. There is a big battle today to get anti-corruption strategy adopted for the next 4 years. And what is interesting in this respect is that the major battle, if we are talking about the parts of the anti-corruption strategy, the major battle is taking place to adopt the part devoted to judicial reform. And I encourage all our participants to write their questions to speakers. And while we're waiting for them, we have one question from Rebecca Harms to Olha Aivazovska. Are there meanwhile some priority topics in regional programs, campaigns of the parties or candidates which show clear differences in what voters can expect from the parties and the candidates? Olha Aivazovska, if you are with us, please address this question. Fortunately, there is something with connection, and while we're waiting for Olga to rejoin us, there is one more question regarding judicial reform. And basically, to this question, I would address to Olha. Are you with us? Okay. I would address this question to Halyna.
Dennis, I may answer question concerning judicial reform. I see it regarding oligarchs' influence on judicial reform. What we saw during spring, that Ihor Kolomoisky tried to break Ukraine's cooperation with IMF because IMF demanded from Ukraine adoption of this law known as anti-banking law. And of course, oligarchs, not only Kolomoisky, but others, they are interested in having corruption in courts, in having judges who will consider cases in their favor. And one of the most famous decisions in favor of Kolomoisky, it is a decision of District Administrative Court of Kiev that was taken in April 2019. This court decided that the nationalization of private bank was illegal. And the three judges who took this decision, they are also the same judges that are now suspected by NABU in other huge crimes against justice. And what we see now is that media controlled by Viktor Medvedchuk, they are covering up for the High Council of Justice, and there are a lot of materials in this media in favor of District Administrative Court of Kiev, which is also mentioned in memorandum with IMF. So oligarchs do not want real judicial reform. And when we talk about judicial reform, we have also a judicial mafia. After the Revolution of Dignity, Ukraine tried to reform High Council of Justice, but we used European model, and judiciary and Congress of Judges were granted majority within High Council of Justice and High Qualification Commission of Judges. The main, our task after the revolution was to clean judiciary from dishonest judges. But we empowered the same dishonest judges with deciding who will decide then on their dismissals. So we let judges themselves decide. And of course, they appointed to High Council of Justice those people which are defending them. And now when we are trying to somehow to change the way the High Council of Justice is composed, they are using European standards on judges elected by judges against any reasonable attempts to somehow change the situation. So, and also one important issue right now, and Andrei mentioned it, we have a very big threat to anti-corruption infrastructure in Constitutional Court. And the situation with the Constitutional Court is the same. Currently, we have 15 judges there, and 9 out of 15 are representatives of this judiciary system, and they were delegated by the same corrupt judges. And when Constitutional Court decides on constitutionality of NABU or High Anti-Corruption Court, which in future may take decisions against some corrupt judges or others, of course, these judicial ties and mafia somehow tries to influence the future decisions of the Constitutional Court. So we now have a situation when civil society, along with international partners, tries to implement judicial reform, but judicial mafia with oligarchs, they have allies in president's office, even in president's team, and they are doing their best trying to oppose reform. And the very possible scenario is when these international commitments of Ukraine, when they will be implemented in a way that will not affect the situation we have. Thus, we can create some panel with international experts, but the result will be that the High Council of Justice will remain the same, because this panel will not have real powers.
Thank you for answering these questions. We have a couple of more questions which are needed to be addressed from Susan Stewart. If our speakers see these questions, who can address? Susan asks about what Lisa Yasko mentioned, internal debates within the Servant of the People Party, and how do you perceive the split within the party, and what are the consequences for judicial and anti-corruption reform in particular? Andriy Borovik or Halyna Chyzhyk, could you please comment on this very briefly?
Excuse me, Dennis, do you mean the latest question of Ms.
Susan Stewart? Susan Stewart.
Yeah.
Asking about the splits within the majority party and whether or not how that's going to is impacting these reforms, because I think it's obviously something that you're seeing play out, and how, whether or not reforms can advance given those splits internally as well, which I think is something that we're seeing also from Washington and Brussels, is that perhaps that the president does not have really the majority for which to pass reforms. In fact, to make it even tougher after local elections. So it's more of a commentary on sort of that particular situation, that even MP Yasko pointed out herself, that there's some real internal differences that are driving, what you just mentioned, which is those that maybe have more connections to oligarchs, maybe those that are maybe even connected more to pro-Russian sentiments as well. And so I think Dennis was just pointing out, but I think it's a key point, because it's really helpful to understand the lay of the land of what's taking place.
I see. Unfortunately, it is very hard to predict, but what we see is that it becomes harder and harder for President's office to collect votes for important bills. It was even hard back during spring, when the land law was voted, to collect important votes. And now it is even much harder, and given COVID pandemic, it is even more harder, and Parliament is now on quarantine, and they are starting considering budget issues. That is why judicial reform is moved to be considered later. And I think all these issues are not helping us. We have a hollow political party, which is the only party supporting this judicial reform agenda. And I think that there may be a coalition between Servants of People and the Hollows, but only if the bill that suggests real judicial reform will be submitted. I think that Hollows may support it. I'm not sure about European Solidarity, Poroshenko political party. I'm not sure that they will support judicial reform, but this splits within Servants of People, to my opinion, they negatively affect their possibility to adopt important legislation. And unfortunately, MPs controlled by Kolomoisky, they become more and more powerful, and unfortunately they gather other MPs.
I will just add that I think it will be useful for all of us just stop looking at servant of the people fraction at the mono majority anymore, because we all know that there is like dozens and dozens of different MPs which belong to different oligarchs. So we again came back to the old movie, like it was in Poroshenko times, when there is a formula was a majority, but actually there were groups of influence and we had to communicate separately with each of them. So let's just stop looking and thinking that the servant of the people are united, and understand that the pro-Western and real, the people with real values are not the majority of the parliament, but I don't know, much less, let's say so.
Thank you for addressing this this question. One more question to Halyna, and I believe to all the speakers. If the memorandum with IMF is not implemented, what will be the consequences? This question is from Rebecca Harms, and she's asking because she fears that Ukrainians might suffer from interruption of disbursement of international financial support if they ignore or delay the agreement.
Dennis, can I just jump in for one just to ask about, there's a referendum. I know that President Zelensky has called for an all-Ukrainian referendum. There is a referendum process that looks like it's running parallel on October 25th. And I'm just curious, forever which one of you want to speak to it. Well, I think that would be you, maybe. Is this a legal and binding referendum? I think there's a little bit of confusion externally what this process is. I mean, in the United States, we have referendums as well. Usually it's on the ballot. It's, part of the ballot, that voters go into a voting booth and they're voting on it. Maybe you just could speak to that too, because it's something that's popped up on the radar. Is this legit, or is it more political, sort of political maneuvering? If you can comment, and any which one of you can, sort of weigh in on that, because it's something that's popped up on our radar. Thank you. Sorry to jump in.
Olha just had a press conference on this issue. Yes, I'll have this comment on this.
I'll answer into it on my presentation, but I will repeat with some details. First of all, the main problem is not questionnaire. The main problem is that president supported one of political party, which is the subject of electoral process. It's party Sluga Naroda. According to international standards and Ukrainian electoral legislation, president has to be on the same distance from the different subject of electoral process. President used the same slogans as this political party on his video request to people and to voters. And this is a problem that he is a part of agitation, national-wide agitation on electoral campaign. This is misusing of administrative resource, because he is using TV channels, he is using political talk shows, because everyone are talking just about these polls. Now, not talking about the real needs for organizing safe election. No one talking about local agenda for this election, how to be more effective, how to elect more effective and capable people, and so on and so forth. Everyone are talking about these polls. It's not the same as you have in the United States, because there is no such norm in Ukrainian legislation, electoral legislation, and there is no such right to organize this poll in the Constitution. According to Article 106, there is no such right in presidential power to organize polls. It doesn't mean that polls is not a valid tool for understanding what is going on the field, what people are thinking, and so on. But presidential office is using sociological researchers day by day, and they know answering to these 5 questions. They just using this tool for propaganda of their political party and agitation. That's why whole other subject of electoral process do not have the same access to the same branch of the power, and they do not have support from president. According to constitution, president is a guarant of our constitutional right. Political right is the part of human rights and a constitutional right. That's why he is violating now the basic political right to have the same rights in electoral process, unfortunately. So that's why the discussion about this research is so high. And another problem that this is not a research. Nobody presented methodology. We know how are working sociological organizations. They are using methodology, they are using sample, they know what will be the margin of error, they know how many people they are going to give this questionnaire, and so on and so forth. Presidential office said, and MPs from the Sluga Narodu party said, that they are going to ask these 5 questions to 5 million Ukrainian voters. But they can organize the same through mobile application DIA action, because we have global digitalization of many processes. We did other researches, governmental official researches through online tools, but we can't do the same on election day because president wants to ask 5 questions. You know, it's a part of manipulation, and this is very bad sign. The president is going to violate constitution if there is such political needs of his own political party. That's why we have such tough discussion in experts groups, because it's not good to start from violation of constitution. And the final thing, we have constitutional court decision of constitutional court from September about NABU. And constitutional court said that previous president violated constitution when they decided who will be the head of National Anti-Corruption Bureau. And President Poroshenko did something else, what Article 106 was saying about his responsibility and his rights. Now President Zelensky is doing the thing, but the level of interest and seriousness of this topic is so small that's, that we have very, like, not emotional, but, you know, human reaction on this technology, PR and pre-election technology, because it's too low for president to do such incredibly stupid things and to start violate constitution because of internal party interests. And we do not know what will happen next time. And COVID-19 measures is the part of this discussion, because people and voters will be under the unsecure area because of the gaps and problems with financial anti-COVID measures, and because of the gaps on conversation between self-government and national government level. And in this crucial period when president has to focus on the security, he is talking about technologies and he doesn't care. I didn't hear any messaging from president that he is working on security of people because of COVID-19 measures. He just developed one more field for connection between people and to have the highest wave of COVID-19's with COVID-19's ill people after this poll and after election.
Thank you. And let's get back to our previous question, if we have time to address one question. And yes,
two questions. Maybe we could just wrap this into sort of final thoughts for speakers, because we're a little bit over time and I want to try to keep it to time. I know colleague Bruno has to leave. Bruno, thank you. I know that you need to move on to the next slide. So thank you so much. But maybe we could just wrap it up into final thoughts, because there's been a couple of questions maybe, but also I think that this last conversation and the last question that I pose really raises some real questions. But maybe we can go to each one of the speakers just for final thoughts, and then we'll close. Does that sound good, Dennis?
Yep. Yes. Let's start with Andrei then.
Just, I think, final thought, nothing new to say that without international support and without international pressure from IMF, EU, any other IFIs, and I just disagree that Ukraine just don't care about the conditionalities. I remind you that Ukraine didn't care about the conditionalities within the third MFA when we lost 600 million euros, if I'm not mistaken, back in 2017, because we didn't fulfill the conditionalities. But that was a time of economic growth. And now we economy going down, and I'm sure that just some people in the administration do not understand fully the reality in which the country is. And with the support from international community and the continued pressure from the civic society, we can achieve the much more results than we have now. And I'm sure that next year will be much better than this one for us.
Thank you. Halyna Chyzhyk, final thoughts.
Thank you. I'm also trying to be optimistic like Andrei. I share the same fears that IMF, if Ukraine does not implement its commitments before IMF and EU, then we will not receive this financial support, which is so important for us. And we know from the statements of the Ministry of Finance that the budget for 2021 was drafted taking into account this money that we are planning to receive as the assistance from our international partners. We, of course, understand that there is no really political will in having proper judicial reform, but I hope that there is an understanding of the consequences if we do not implement one. And I still hope that President and the people who surround him, they are Western oriented, and they are not hoping that they can just take money from Russia or other countries. So let's join our efforts, and of course the support of international community is very important for us. We are limited in the instruments we may use, but we have the most important one. It is the international commitments of Ukraine, and it is still possible to implement it in a way that we can continue cooperation with international partners and have good improvements within judicial field.
Thank you, Halyna. And finally, Olha Aivazovska, your last thoughts.
Very interesting election, not because of new legislation, new competition between national-wide power group and local power group, but because of some examples of interference of Russia Federation and unfortunately our Hungary neighbors, because official representatives of the Hungary government organized agitation campaign on our territories for Hungary political party. I believe that it's not a good standard, and I hope that EU can somehow react on this information. We documentize these facts, we send it to our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and so on and so forth, but I hope that security, independency and territorial integrity, it's about all neighbors. And the trust between our countries is very important too. From another hand, we have some examples of Russian interference and their security cyber interference into Ukrainian informational wave channels and communication. They sent fake letters to Ukrainian political parties, for example, European Solidarity from so-called SBU, Security Council of Ukraine, with provocative questions to party, and they got the emotional reaction from party. As we understood, there is no even middle level of understanding what does it mean cybersecurity, even on national-wide political party. Can you imagine what is the general level of awareness of Ukrainian people in this area? And I hope that this is our common interest, EU, Americans and Ukrainian stakeholders, to be more secure with cyber attacks, against cyber attacks from Russian Federation. I hope that we will have a chance to research all these cases and to talk about that for prospective activities and awareness of political institutions, official institutions, NGOs, and citizens in this area. It's very important to have not just formally free and fair election, but to build its own, their own, our own political position on the ground of truth, relevant information, and without manipulation, especially from Russian side.
Thank you, and back to you, Jonathan.
Great. I think that, you know, those last points are really important. I can just tell you, on the U.S. side, facing many of the same challenges, challenges of disinformation. We're also facing some Hungarian interference in our elections as well, which is quite interesting. But I wanted to just thank all of our speakers. You know, all of you we really appreciate you taking time to walk us through some very challenging and complex issues. I want to thank my colleagues at RPR. Dennis, thank you so much for co-hosting with us today. Orest as well, Bruno, who left. But we'll be watching the outcome of the election and also the second round as well on judicial reform and anti-corruption reform. I certainly hear from you regarding the need to keep both the international pressure, whether it's the EU, the US, IMF, on the government to keep moving that process forward. I think we'll have a little bit of greater clarity come our election as to how the US may be approaching these issues. And I think there's certainly some differences between a potential Trump 2 administration or a Biden administration and how to approach these issues. But I will say Ukraine will continue to be a priority. I think Orest would say too, bipartisan from the United States and as well as the EU. It will be a matter of sort of the level of engagement and resources. And I think we're all aware of the challenges of COVID-19 that you guys are facing. And I think as worried as you are about sort of how people can get to the polls to vote on election day if they don't feel safe and secure, if they don't feel like their election systems are safe and they don't have confidence in the process. It's a battle. I think that sort of these last points about ensuring that we're all on the same page, democracies, those that want to see free, fair, and transparent elections, what that looks like in 2020 and going forward is going to be a challenge for all of us to work together on, and not just in Ukraine, but in the United States as well. So on that note, I just want to thank everybody again. And this has been, you know, really great conversation. I apologize. I know we have a number of questions that we couldn't get to. You know, hopefully our next time around, we'll have more time for some of those questions. But I think many of the people who are writing in also have direct connections to many of you in Kiev. And I just wish you good luck in the next few days as this election moves forward. And also just, you know, for everybody's safety, given COVID-19, we wish everybody the best. Please be safe, wear your masks, you know, and we'll look forward to our next conversation soon. Dennis, thank you again. Thank you to our speakers. You were amazing. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to our next conversation. Thank you from Washington.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.